June 26, 1944, an unexpected visitor. The checkers match remained incomplete as Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald glanced toward his screen door. A visitor had just stated his name, though MacDonald's attention remained on the game with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer for Satan's Angels. The civilian spoke his name again with unmistakable quiet assurance, forcing MacDonald to focus. Charles Lindbergh, America's most celebrated aviator, stood in a temporary recreation facility, thousands of miles from civilization, requesting to discuss P-38 combat tactics. Neither individual could predict that this interruption would fundamentally alter long-distance fighter operations across the Pacific theater. The methods Lindbergh would demonstrate during the following 6 weeks would expand the Lockheed P-38 Lightning's operational range by approximately 400 miles, converting operations pilots deemed unfeasible into routine procedures. This account of how a civilian advisor it represents institutional opposition defeated by conclusive evidence, aviators discovering that mathematical principles superseded gut feelings, and one individual's specialized understanding of fuel conservation reshaping Pacific aerial combat. The principles of extended-range operations were being documented, not through official engineering specifications but through the daily experiences of pilots, who would discover that their complete training regarding engine operation had been insufficient. The unfeasible was the journey to that screen door in Hollandia commenced 17 years earlier above the Atlantic. The foundation, the spirit of Street Lewis. Between May 20th to 21st, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh had revolutionized aviation by completing a solo 600-mile flight from New York to Paris in 33.5 hours. His aircraft, the Ryan NYP monoplane Spirit of Street Lewis, contained 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so massive they eliminated forward visibility. Lindbergh navigated using a periscope and dead reckoning, managing fuel with a precision that would have appeared obsessive to contemporary pilots. He touched down at Le Bourget field retaining 85 gallons, having achieved fuel efficiency that specialists had declared impossible for a right whirlwind radial engine. This meticulous fuel management approach became Lindbergh's signature technical capability. During the 1930s, while conducting survey missions for Pan American Airways across Pacific and Atlantic routes, Lindbergh developed methods that exceeded manufacturer specifications substantially. He recognized that published range data represented averages rather than absolute limits. Each engine possessed an ideal operational range where power generation, fuel utilization, and mechanical strain achieved optimal equilibrium. Discovering that range demanded comprehending the relationships among manifold pressure, propeller RPM, mixture configurations, and indicated airspeed in ways that exceeded conventional instruction. By 1944, Lindbergh had established himself among the world's leading long-range flight authorities, though his relationship with American military forces was compromised by pre-war isolationist positions. He had advocated vigorously against American participation in European conflicts, directing the America First Committee and earning President Franklin Roosevelt's antagonism. On April 29, 1941, following Roosevelt's public comparison of him to Civil War Confederate sympathizer Clement Vallandigham, Lindbergh resigned his Air Corps Reserve Colonel's commission. When Pearl Harbor thrust America into conflict, Lindbergh attempted military reenlistment. Roosevelt personally guaranteed Lindbergh would not wear American military uniform throughout the war. However, expertise discovers pathways. Unable to serve as a military officer, Lindbergh became a civilian technical advisor for aircraft manufacturers. He joined United Aircraft Corporation in 1943, working extensively with their Chance Vought division, manufacturers of the F-4U Corsair. He spent time at Ford's Willow Run facility troubleshooting B-24 Liberator production challenges. He conducted hazardous high-altitude experimental flights in P-47 Thunderbolts for engine performance evaluation. He assisted in developing dive bombing techniques for the Corsair. His technical contributions were substantial, yet Lindbergh desired combat experience. By early 1944, he identified an opportunity. United Aircraft sought to evaluate a new twin-engine fighter concept. The only American representative in this category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh persuaded United Aircraft to deploy him to the Pacific Theater as a technical representative to observe P-38 operations under combat circumstances. On April 3, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for South Pacific deployment. He visited Brooks Brothers in New York, acquiring a naval officer's uniform without insignia. At Brentano's bookstore, he purchased a compact New Testament, recording in his journal that day, "Since I can only carry one book and a very small one, that is my choice. It would not have been a decade ago, but the more I learn and the more I read, the less competition it has." He departed San Diego on April 24th, officially destined for Marine Corps aviation installations in the South Pacific around Guadalcanal. The assignment was authorized by the Navy Department but concealed from the White House. Neither President Roosevelt nor Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox knew Lindbergh was heading to the combat zone. What commenced as an observation assignment evolved when Marine Corps aviation officers invited Lindbergh to participate as an observer on combat operations. On May 21, 1944, Lindbergh flew his initial combat sortie, a strafing mission with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. The Marines designated it observation. Lindbergh flew with weapons active, engaging targets when opportunities arose. He rapidly demonstrated practical expertise exceeding theoretical knowledge. Working with Corsair pilots, he showed them methods to safely take off with bomb loads double the for use rated capacity. The Marines had experienced aircraft losses due to overweight incidents. Lindbergh's careful evaluation of power configurations, takeoff velocities, and weight distribution reduced accidents while enhancing strike capability. Information spread throughout the Pacific theater that the renowned aviator was flying combat operations as a civilian and resolving operational challenges that had perplexed military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh had developed interest in the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in twin-engine fighters was legitimate. However, Lindbergh had also learned that the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, represented one of the premier Lightning units in the Pacific. For understanding the P-38, that was the destination. On June 15, 1944, Lindbergh secured transportation to Finschhafen, New Guinea. He announced his presence to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadzab, where Colonel Merian Cooper hosted him for lunch. On Sunday evening, June 18, Lindbergh dined with General Ennis Whitehead discussing New Guinea developments and his plans to observe P-38 operations. The authorization was informal, unofficial, and inadequate by strict military standards. However, in the flexible command structure of the Southwest Pacific Theater, personal connections and demonstrated competence frequently mattered more than documentation. On June 20, Lindbergh spent 1 hour and 20 minutes receiving checkout training in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. It represented his initial experience in the distinctive twin-boom fighter. On June 26, he flew to Hollandia and interrupted Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald's checkers match. MacDonald was 29 years old and already a 10-victory ace. He commanded the 475th Fighter Group, which had been activated in Australia on May 14, 1943, and had subsequently become one of the highest-scoring P-38 units in the theater. The group's 3 squadrons, the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd, flew the latest P-38J models featuring improved intercoolers and additional fuel capacity. These Lightnings were the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, capable of missions no other aircraft could accomplish. However, even with drop tanks, the P-38's operational radius remained limited. Missions to distant targets left minimal fuel for combat maneuvering, and pilots regularly returned to base with uncomfortably low fuel reserves. Several aircraft had been lost when weather necessitated detours exceeding fuel capacity. MacDonald initially dismissed Lindbergh politely, returning to his checkers match. However, when Lindbergh explained that General Hutchison, 3rd Air Task Force commander, had sent him to discuss P-38 combat operations, MacDonald paid attention. After brief conversation, MacDonald asked Lindbergh if he wished to fly a mission the following day. Lindbergh accepted. The mission would launch at dawn, rather than return to headquarters. MacDonald suggested Lindbergh remain at the 475th camp to eliminate transportation complications. As Lindbergh settled onto the spare cot, information spread rapidly throughout the unit. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's Angels. The reaction among pilots was divided. Lieutenant John Pirong of the 433rd Squadron anticipated meeting the legendary aviator. Others were skeptical. Some questioned whether a 42-year-old civilian, famous or not, could manage modern combat. Major Thomas McGuire, already a 15-victory ace who would finish the war as America's second highest-scoring fighter, pilot with 38 confirmed kills, wanted to observe what the veteran could accomplish. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his first P-38 combat mission. The weather was poor, rain falling steadily at 0530 hours. By 10:30, when the flight finally launched, conditions had improved. MacDonald led for aircraft toward Jeffman Island and Salmon Airfield, regular targets for the 475th. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 on McGuire's wing. The other aircraft was piloted by Merrill Smith, already an 8 Victory ace. MacDonald observed Lindbergh slip into perfect formation on McGuire's wing. For someone who had checked out in the P-38 only days earlier, his formation flying was impeccable. The mission involved strafing an enemy barge in Gilvink Bay. Lindbergh maneuvered through anti-aircraft fire, his cannon and machine guns striking the target. The mission succeeded and all 4 aircraft returned safely. However, what the ground crews noticed after landing would prove more significant than any combat action. The discovery: fuel efficiency. When ground personnel inspected Lindbergh's P-38, after several missions, they discovered a pattern. His aircraft consistently returned with substantially more fuel remaining than other pilots flying identical missions. After a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance mission on July 1 to enemy airstrips along Gilvink Bay's western shore, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons of fuel remaining. Other pilots from the same mission returned with fuel gauges indicating your empty tanks. On July 3, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a strike against Jeffman Island. After the attack, the Lightnings conducted barge hunting. Within an hour, 2 pilots reported dwindling fuel and broke off for home. Lindbergh continued the mission, his fuel gauges showing comfortable reserves. MacDonald noticed the discrepancy and called a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, the colonel gathered the 475th's pilots in their recreation hall. The facility was crude-packed dirt floors beneath a palm-thatched roof, 1 ping-pong table, and some card decks completing the furnishings. Under glaring and shaded light bulbs, MacDonald commenced business. He introduced Lindbergh formally and asked him to explain how he consistently returned with more fuel than any other pilot in the group. What transpired next would transform P-38 operations throughout the Pacific Theater. The revolutionary technique. Lindbergh stood before the assembled pilots and explained cruise control techniques he had developed for the Lightning. The standard operating procedure taught to all P-38 pilots specified cruising at 2,200 to 2,400 RPM, with mixture set to auto-rich. This setting provided good power and was considered safe for the engines, but it was also wasteful. Lindbergh explained that by reducing engine speed from the standard 2,200 revolutions per minute down to 1,600 revolutions per minute, setting the fuel mixture to auto-lean rather than auto-rich, and slightly increasing manifold pressure to compensate for the lower RPM, pilots could dramatically reduce fuel consumption without losing effective cruise speed. The specific settings he recommended were 1,600 revolutions per minute at 30 inches of mercury manifold pressure, with mixture set to auto-lean and indicated airspeed of 185 miles per hour. These settings reduced fuel consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour total, achieving about 2.6 miles per gallon. Compared to standard cruise settings consuming significantly more fuel, the savings were enormous. Lindbergh predicted these techniques would stretch the Lightning's radius by 400 miles, enabling 9-hour missions. When he concluded his presentation 30 minutes later, the room fell silent. The pilots contemplated several uncomfortable thoughts. The notion of a 9-hour flight did not sit well with men who already found 7-hour missions punishing. The P-38 cockpit was cramped. Pilots sat on their parachutes with an emergency raft and dinghy beneath that. Their survival suits were uncomfortable. 7 hours in that cockpit was already pushing human endurance limits. 9 hours seemed inconceivable. More troubling was Lindbergh's recommendation to run engines at settings they had been specifically taught to avoid. The combination of low RPM and high manifold pressure was called running over square. Military flight training emphasized that over square operation would damage engines. The resulting detonation would cause cylinder heads to overheat, leading to catastrophic engine failure. Pilots were taught that if manifold pressure exceeded RPM by more than a few inches, they risked destroying their engines. Now the civilian was suggesting they should routinely operate their engines in a condition they had been warned was dangerous. The skepticism in the room was palpable. Several pilots exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. One pilot openly called Lindbergh's technique dangerous. However, MacDonald understood something important. Lindbergh was not speaking from theory. He had flown combat missions using these settings. His P-38 had not suffered engine problems. His aircraft had returned repeatedly with fuel reserves that gave operational flexibility other pilots lacked. The colonel decided to put the technique to a practical test. If it worked, the 475th would have a decisive operational advantage. If it failed, they would know quickly enough. Proving the method over the next week, pilots began cautiously experimenting with Lindbergh's cruise settings. The initial flights were short, allowing pilots to return to base quickly if engines showed signs of distress. The first pilots to try the technique reported nervously that their engines sounded different. At the lower RPM, the deep rumble of the Allison V1710 engines changed character, but temperature gauges remained normal. Oil pressure stayed within acceptable ranges. Cylinder head temperatures, the critical indicator of detonation, actually ran cooler than at higher RPM settings. As confidence grew, pilots began using Lindbergh's techniques on longer missions. The fuel savings were undeniable. Missions that had required immediate return after target strikes could now include extended combat air patrol. Flights that had forced pilots to carefully monitor fuel consumption now ended with comfortable reserves. The P-38's effective combat radius, previously about 570 miles, extended to 700 miles, then 750 miles. Pilots discovered they could reach targets that had been considered beyond the Lightning's capability, fight for 15 minutes over the target area, and still return with a 1-hour fuel reserve. The transformation was revolutionary. The skepticism evaporated as mission after mission proved the technique's effectiveness. Lindbergh flew regularly with the 475th, accumulating combat hours and teaching by example. He led flights, demonstrating that the civilian observer could handle combat as well as any military pilot. On missions he led, his call sign was simple: Mr. Lindbergh. Understanding the physics, Lindbergh explained the physics behind the technique in ways that helped pilots understand why it worked. Aircraft engines produce power by burning fuel to create pressure that drives pistons. The amount of fuel burned per unit time determines fuel consumption. The goal is to maximize efficiency, producing the most power for the least fuel. Traditional high RPM cruise settings produced plenty of power but wasted fuel because the engine cycled rapidly, burning fuel unnecessarily. By reducing RPM and increasing manifold pressure, the same power could be produced with fewer combustion cycles, each using fuel more efficiently. The lean mixture setting further improved efficiency by providing just enough fuel for complete combustion, eliminating the excess used in auto-rich mode for engine cooling at high power settings. The engines did not detonate because the power setting, though over square by ratio, was not actually high power operation. Manifold pressure of 30 inches was moderate, well below the 60-inch war emergency power settings used for takeoff and combat. The lower RPM actually reduced mechanical stress on engine components. The technique was not dangerous. It was simply different from what pilots had been taught. Lindbergh's expertise came from years of experience with long-range flight. His 1927 Atlantic crossing had taught him that published specifications were starting points, not limits. His work with Pan American Airways in the 1930s, surveying trans-Pacific and transatlantic routes, had given him thousands of hours to experiment with fuel management. The P-38 had an advantage that made experimentation less risky than it seemed: twin engines. If one engine suffered damage from the experimental cruise technique, the other engine could bring the pilot home. Over the vast Pacific, where mechanical failure meant death by drowning or capture by the Japanese, most pilots in single-engine fighters flew conservatively. However, the P-38's redundancy created a margin for safely exploring the envelope, and Lindbergh knew from the supply situation that the risk was acceptable. Allison was shipping spare V1710 engines and parts to the Pacific in generous quantities. If an engine needed replacement after experimental operation, ground crews could install a fresh power plant quickly. The operational advantage of extended range justified accepting a small risk of increased engine wear. The calculation proved correct. No P-38 engines failed due to Lindbergh's cruise techniques. Spreading adoption. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control techniques were spreading throughout 5th Air Force P-38 units. The 475th Fighter Group's success was impossible to ignore. Word spread to other squadrons. Pilots talked. Ground crews compared fuel consumption data. Other commanders wanted the same operational advantage Satan's Angels now enjoyed. Lindbergh gave additional presentations to. He explained the technique patiently, answering technical questions, addressing concerns about engine safety, The adoption was not immediate or universal, but it was steady. Combat action. July 28, 1944. July 28, 1944 brought Lindbergh's most dramatic moment with the 475th. The mission was a bomber escort to the Charam area, flying with the 433rd Squadron. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 in a 4-ship flight over Amboina Bay. Blue flight encountered enemy aircraft. To Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonyas, Japanese light bombers used for reconnaissance and ground attack, were returning from searching for a missing comrade. The Sonyas belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. One was piloted by the unit's commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, the other by Sergeant Yokogi. The American fighters attacked. The Sonyas were outmatched, slower, less maneuverable, and lightly armed compared to the Lightnings. They should have been easy kills, but Shimada was an experienced pilot who had no intention of dying easily. The engagement turned into a running battle. P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron had found the Sonyas first and were already engaged. When McDonald's flight arrived, Shimada's wingman, Sergeant Yokogi, was hit by cannon fire from Lieutenant Wade Lewis. The Sonya's left wing caught fire. As the enemy aircraft straightened out to run, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip slipped behind and fired a long burst. The stricken Sonya trailed smoke and dove into the sea. Shimada's Sonya continued the fight. For 30 minutes, the Japanese captain outmaneuvered multiple attacking P-38s. He threw his aircraft into violent banks, wingtips streaming condensation as he racked the Sonya through maximum rate turns. P-38 pilots tried pulling lead on the target but couldn't hold the aim point. The slower Japanese aircraft could turn inside the faster American fighters. Captain Danforth Miller, McDonald's wingman, managed to briefly get the Sonya in his gun sight but lost track as Shimada completed a hard left turn. Miller's tracers fell 80 feet behind. Then Shimada did something unexpected. Rather than continuing evasive maneuvers, he turned directly toward the approaching Lindbergh. The two aircraft flew at each other head-on at a closing speed of nearly 500 miles per hour. For Lindbergh, a man who had flown thousands of hours but never faced an enemy aircraft trying to kill him, the moment crystallized with terrible clarity. Shimada held his course, whether attempting a ramming attack or simply hoping to exchange fire head-on. The Japanese captain committed to a collision course. Lindbergh instinctively sighted on the Sonya's radial engine and pressed his trigger. The P-38's armament, 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, concentrated in the nose, erupted for 6 seconds. Lindbergh held the trigger down. Bullets and shells slammed into the front of the Sonya. The Mitsubishi's propeller visibly slowed. Smoke poured from the engine, but Shimada held his course. At the last moment, Lindbergh pulled up violently, his P-38 passing over the damaged Sonya with feet to spare. Shimada's aircraft went into a steep dive. Other P-38s fired additional bursts. The Sonya continued diving, trailing smoke until it hit the ocean at high speed. A fountain of white spray marked the impact. Foam spread in concentric circles on the water's surface. Then the waves merged back into the sea. The surface was as it had been before. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were dead. Back at base, the kill credit was discussed. Multiple pilots had hit the Sonya. McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh had all scored hits. But it was Lindbergh's head-on burst that had mortally wounded the aircraft, slowing the propeller and starting the fatal dive. And officially, the pilots agreed, Lindbergh had scored his first and only kill. The victory was not entered in the 475th's official war record. Lindbergh was a civilian. His participation in combat was already irregular. Recording an official kill would raise questions that might end his time with the unit. Close call and departure 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly died. The mission was a fighter sweep to the Pala Islands. The flight encountered Japanese Zeros. In the ensuing dogfight, Lindbergh found himself in a turning fight with a Zero pilot who very nearly shot him down. Only McDonald's intervention, calling brake right, and then engaging the Zero himself, saved Lindbergh's life. The close call convinced 5th Air Force headquarters that enough was enough. Lindbergh had proven his techniques worked. He had flown approximately 50 combat missions across all his Pacific service, including about 25 P-38 missions with the 475th. He had shot down an enemy aircraft. He had nearly been killed. It was time to return him to the United States before something went irreversibly wrong. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh left Hollandia to return home. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group gathered to see him off. Their respect for the civilian technical representative was genuine. He had not just taught them techniques that extended their combat radius. He had flown with them, fought with them, and proven himself in conditions where rank and fame meant nothing. Strategic impact. The impact of Lindbergh's fuel efficiency techniques extended far beyond the 475th Fighter Group. By October 1944, P-38 units throughout the Pacific were using variations of his cruise control settings. The specific numbers varied slightly between units and conditions, but the principle was universal: lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, leaner mixture, all combined to extend range dramatically. The operational implications were profound. Targets that had been unreachable became accessible. Japanese bases that had enjoyed immunity from fighter escorts now faced P-38s with enough fuel to fight over the target and return home safely. The extended range allowed fighters to escort bombers on missions that had previously been flown unescorted or not flown at all. Long-range fighter sweeps could penetrate deeper into Japanese-held territory. The P-38 groups in Dutch New Guinea were soon flying 950 miles to targets, fighting for 15 minutes, and returning to base. Such missions had been impossible before Lindbergh's techniques became standard practice. The range extension was not trivial. In the second half of 1944, the increased combat radius enabled operations that directly supported MacArthur's advance toward the Philippines. Airfields that could not have been supported by existing fighter ranges became viable forward bases. Invasion plans that had required waiting for closer airfields could proceed more quickly. The strategic impact was measured not just in miles but in time. Operations that would have taken months were completed in weeks, because fighter cover could reach farther faster. The technique also saved lives. Pilots who previously returned to base with fuel gauges showing empty now had reserves for emergencies. Bad weather that forced detours no longer meant certain loss of aircraft. Pilots who sustained damage in combat had better chances of reaching home. The fuel reserves provided a safety margin that directly reduced combat losses from non-combat causes. Philippine liberation. The extended range proved especially valuable during the liberation of the Philippines, when MacArthur's forces invaded Leyte in October 1944. P-38s flying from bases in New Guinea and Morotai provided fighter cover over distances that had been impossible months earlier. The difference between reaching the target with no fuel reserves and reaching it with an hour of fuel meant the difference between providing effective cover and merely showing up. Yet the adoption of these techniques was not without controversy. Some commanders initially resisted, concerned about engine reliability. Some pilots remained skeptical, trusting their training more than a civilian's advice. Some maintenance officers worried about increased wear on engines. However, the evidence was undeniable. Units using Lindbergh's techniques reported no increase in engine failures. Fuel consumption data showed dramatic improvements. Mission reports documented successful operations that had been impossible before. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control technique was officially incorporated into P-38 operating procedures. What had begun as a civilian technical representative's observation had become standard doctrine. Thus, Army Air Forces published updated cruise control charts for the P-38 that reflected Lindbergh's discoveries. Pilot training materials were revised to include proper lean of peak mixture operation. The broader context, the broader story of Lindbergh's Pacific service, reveals a man driven by complex motivations. His pre-war isolationism had made him a controversial figure. His comments about aviation technology in Nazi Germany had earned him accusations of Nazi sympathy. His public opposition to American entry into World War II had destroyed his relationship with President Roosevelt. When war came, Lindbergh found himself a pariah despite being one of America's most accomplished aviators. However, in the Pacific theater, far from Washington politics, Lindbergh found redemption through technical competence. The Marine and Army Air Force pilots who flew with him judged him not on political positions, but on flying skill and courage. Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories achieved while serving with the Fighter Command headquarters and various units across the theater, told a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as hot a pilot as any of us. He would have been out there knocking off Japs every day if General Kenny had let him. The assessment from someone of Bong's caliber meant more than any political rehabilitation could have provided. Lindbergh had proven himself where proof mattered most, in combat. After returning to the United States in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh continued his technical contributions to the war effort. In October 1944, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter aircraft performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland. He flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, providing insights into enemy capabilities. He continued consulting for United Aircraft and other manufacturers, troubleshooting problems that arose in combat operations. Technical specifications. The technical specifications of what Lindbergh accomplished reveal the magnitude of improvement. The P-38J Lightning had internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons in standard tanks, to 90-gallon mains, to 60-gallon reserves, and to 55-gallon leading-edge tanks, with provisions for external drop tanks. Total capacity could exceed 1,000 gallons. At standard cruise settings of 2,200 revolutions per minute and auto-rich mixture. Fuel consumption varied by source but was significantly higher than Lindbergh's method. Lindbergh's technique reduced consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour total. Combat radius increased from approximately 570 miles to 750 miles with the same combat. And reserve allowances, representing a 31% improvement. For missions requiring maximum range, additional drop tanks combined with cruise techniques achieved flights approaching 9 hours, covering over 1,000 miles. These capabilities transformed Pacific operations. The strategic island hopping campaign that characterized MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and into the Philippines relied on air superiority at each stage. Fighter range determined which islands could be bypassed, and which required direct assault to provide airfields. By extending fighter range, Lindbergh's techniques allowed bolder operational planning. Islands that would have required costly amphibious assaults could be bypassed, because fighters could reach targets from more distant bases. Historical clarification. Some historians have incorrectly attributed Lindbergh's range extension techniques to the April 1943 mission that intercepted and shot down Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport aircraft. That mission, flown by P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron based at Guadalcanal, did push the Lightning's range limits, but Lindbergh had nothing to do with it. He did not arrive in the Pacific theater until more than a year later. What Lindbergh contributed was making such extreme-range missions routine rather than exceptional. The human element of Lindbergh's achievement deserves emphasis. He was 42 years old when he deployed to the Pacific, flying combat missions against pilots 20 years younger. The physical demands of high-G maneuvering, the stress of combat, the discomfort of 7 to 9-hour flights in a cramped cockpit all took their toll. However, Lindbergh never asked for special treatment. He flew the same missions, faced the same dangers, and followed the same procedures as the young lieutenants and captains who made up the bulk of the 475th. His willingness to prove his techniques through personal demonstration was crucial to their acceptance. If he had simply lectured about fuel management from the safety of headquarters, pilots would have dismissed him as another theorist who didn't understand combat realities. By flying missions and consistently proving his techniques worked, he earned credibility that no amount of rank or fame could have provided. Institutional impact. The psychological impact of Lindbergh's success extended beyond fuel management. He demonstrated that civilian technical expertise had value in combat operations. Military organizations naturally privilege rank and combat experience, but complex modern warfare required technical sophistication that often resided outside the military chain of command. Lindbergh proved that civilians with specialized knowledge could contribute meaningfully to combat effectiveness if given the opportunity. His success encouraged military commanders to listen to civilian technical representatives from aircraft manufacturers, engine companies, and research organizations. The improved cooperation between military users and civilian developers accelerated the pace of technical innovation throughout the war. The P-38 Lightning. The P-38 Lightning itself deserves recognition as an aircraft that enabled Lindbergh's techniques. The twin-engine configuration provided the redundancy that made experimentation safer. The Allison V1710 engines, while often criticized for various problems, responded well to careful mixture management. The P-38's fuel system, with its multiple tanks and transfer pumps, allowed pilots to manage fuel carefully. The aircraft's stability made it suitable for long-duration cruise flight. By late 1944 and early 1945, the P-38 was being replaced in some theaters by the P-51 Mustang, which offered better performance at high altitude and longer range with the same fuel load. However, in the Pacific, the P-38 remained valuable throughout the war. Its twin engines provided safety over water. Its heavy armament delivered devastating firepower. Its maneuverability at low to medium altitudes suited Pacific combat conditions. and its range, especially when flown using Lindbergh's techniques, remained exceptional. Final statistics. The final statistics tell the story. The 475th Fighter Group, flying P-38s exclusively, achieved 551 aerial victories, making it the top P-38 unit in the war. America's second highest scoring ace, Major Thomas Maguire with 38 victories, flew P-38s with the 475th. The aircraft's combination of range, firepower, and reliability made it the dominant fighter in the theater, and the extended range Lindbergh's techniques provided enhanced every aspect of P-38 operations. Missions could reach farther, fight longer, and return safer. The cumulative impact over thousands of sorties and hundreds of thousands of flight hours was immeasurable but real. Expertise versus institutions. The story also highlights the sometimes uncomfortable relationship between expertise and institutions. Lindbergh's pre-war political positions had made him unwelcome in official military service. President Roosevelt's personal animosity prevented Lindbergh from serving in uniform. Yet the Army Air Force needed exactly the expertise Lindbergh possessed. The solution: unofficial civilian status. However, it worked. Institutional rigidity gave way to operational pragmatism. The result benefited the war effort immeasurably. The men who flew with Lindbergh in 1944 never forgot what he taught them. In interviews conducted decades later, former 470 Colonel Warren Lewis, who commanded the 432nd Squadron, recalled Lindbergh's fuel-saving settings precisely decades later. The specifics varied slightly in different accounts, reflecting adaptation to different conditions and aircraft models. But the principle was universal and the results undeniable. Legacy and death. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at age 72 from lymphoma at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. He had secretly left Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York on August 17, arriving in Maui just 1 week before his death. He was buried approximately 3 hours after death in a simple handmade coffin, built by Hawaiian ranch cowboys wearing work clothes, in a grave dug deep and lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles, at Palapalahomo Church Cemetery. Only 15 people attended. The grave marker is a simple concrete slab with the epitaph from Psalm 139. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. His wartime journals, published in 1970, provided detailed accounts of his Pacific service, including his time with the 475th. Enduring principles. The legacy of Lindbergh's Pacific service extends beyond the specific techniques he taught. He demonstrated principles that remain relevant. Technical expertise matters in combat operations. Civilian specialists can contribute meaningfully if given opportunity. Institutional procedures should be questioned and improved when evidence supports change. Personal demonstration is more persuasive than abstract argument. And perhaps most importantly, there is always room for improvement, even in systems that seem fully developed. In the final analysis, Lindbergh's achievement in the Pacific represents a unique intersection of specialized expertise and operational necessity. The Pacific theater demanded extreme range from fighters. Existing procedures limited range below what the aircraft was technically capable of achieving. Lindbergh possessed unique knowledge in fuel management from decades of focus on efficiency. He had the opportunity to apply that expertise in combat conditions, where results could be measured objectively. He had the courage to demonstrate his techniques personally, risking his life to prove his theories. And he possessed the humility to work with pilots as an equal, rather than demanding recognition for his fame. Conclusion: knowledge is victory. The story of German prisoners of war, witnessing American industrial might, showed psychological transformation through overwhelming material evidence. Lindbergh's story shows technical transformation through demonstrated expertise. Both reveal that sometimes the greatest victories come not through force, but through knowledge applied with precision and proven through example. The German prisoners returned home knowing that democratic prosperity could create abundance. The American fighter pilots who learned from Lindbergh gained techniques that multiplied their operational effectiveness while bringing them home safely. The P-38 Lightning flew on until war's end, its distinctive twin-boom silhouette a symbol of American air power in the Pacific. The pilots who flew it remembered the aircraft with affection despite its quirks and challenges. And those who flew it in 1944 and after remember also the civilian who taught them that the impossible was merely difficult, that published limits were starting points rather than boundaries, and that understanding could unlock capabilities hidden in plain sight. That is Lindbergh's Pacific legacy, not the combat victories or the missions flown, but the knowledge shared and the techniques taught. He came as an observer and left as a teacher. He arrived as a celebrity and departed as a comrade, and he transformed an aircraft's capabilities through nothing more than understanding how it truly worked and having the courage to prove better methods existed. The pilots of Satan's Angels knew what Lindbergh had given them. They flew farther, fought longer, and returned safer because of knowledge shared freely by a civilian who understood fuel efficiency better than anyone else in the Pacific. That knowledge, proven in combat and adopted throughout the theater, represents one of the most successful technical innovations of the Pacific Air War. And it came not from laboratories or engineering departments, but from one man's specialized mastery of an art he had perfected 17 years earlier, over the Atlantic Ocean. That mastery, applied in a different context with different aircraft, proved as valuable in 1944 as it had been in 1927. The principle remained constant: understanding the aircraft completely, managing resources precisely, and never accepting that published limits were real limits. Lindbergh lived that principle, and for 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, he taught it to some of the finest fighter pilots in the Pacific, who in turn taught it to others, spreading knowledge that changed how America fought the air war in the Pacific.